Yeah, please. Okay, thank you all for coming today, and thank you especially to Bettina, who's worked so hard with the effects of which folding out over the last few days. Bettina's managed to meet all of the riders of all of the keynotes with great difficulty, but without any repercussions, and I think that's one of the toughest jobs when you're managing key folk in the field and trying to get the spirit of the conference coalesce. Okay, I have 30 minutes, but I probably will take 40, and 30 minutes to talk through my concern and interests in terms of thinking through emotional geographies and race, and as you can imagine, it's a tall task. So what I'm left with is a space to outline or etch, if you like, my thinking. So you'll get a sketch, and luckily I'm here with my co-collaborator, Rosanna Raymond, international artist, exhibits and works with key institutions internationally, including the British Museum, Tate Papper Museum in New Zealand, institutes in Birmingham, such as the Icon Gallery, and is a performance artist as well as a curator at those institutions. In terms of thinking about the themes, the session that Steve Watson and Emma Waterton, have also co-organised today is on affecting heritage, and so some of the themes that I'll be flagging up will fold out through the session that Emma has been key in organising, despite the fact that there's 3 of our names. Sorry, Steve. But I hope that you're able to join us at some of those things if you're interested in the themes. So in terms of the sessions, we're working through a more robust account of the interface between the sites that I'm talking about, so the racialised body, the museum space, and narratives of culture, narrative cultures of world heritage, if you like, that define the past and present, and provide a legacy for future generations. I also want to say thank you to Rosie Bradiotti, who set the tone of the debate in terms of the launch of her book, Posthuman, and inspirational thinking around the posthuman. It's great to have a colleague for whom the university and academic life is about creating a space of aspiration to freedom, and this is a key moment in UK university in particular, and one of the keynotes that's not here, who are involved in thinking through the new conditions of work and thought for all of us. And what Rosie argues is that the university should be a space towards freedom, and this is what she says, through the specific conditions at macro and micro scale and relations of power that are imminent to our historical location, so moving away from the origins and understanding of university. So for both of us, it seems that geographically located power, body and situatedness are integral to philosophy and ethics at the heart of a manifesto for the university working towards freedoms for all. It is for this reason that I titled this talk as I did, to link to the circulations of theory and to think through the dominating turn towards post-human and working through the assumptions that are made about the human that are encompassed in that notion. So what it is to be human, and the capacities and possibilities of the past and future are at stake. So the paper touches upon how race and notions of post-human, non-human, pre-human figure in the representation of race at the museum, and to take you through the politics and practices around 21st century museum accounts, if you like. So the emotions have been at core in defining human capacities, the capacity to feel, the capacity to have the finest of sensibilities, and most often than not, in terms of 19th century scientific racism, those capacities to feel in the highest and finest of ways was located in Europe and the European sensibility. So emotions and the capacities of folk and their sensuality and sensibilities have been at the heart of how we define what is human and how human we are and what sort of human we are, and in turn the rights that you hold to life or death. So in terms of the war on terror, there's a notion that we're measured by our emotional conscience, so our conscience that's at the heart of whether we're good or bad as human beings, or whether we're good or bad Muslim Britons or Americans. So in terms of emotions, are we on the right moral compass? are played out in the discourse in the public sphere. So the emotion geographies canon which the conference celebrates is a body of work which commits to that principle of attending to power, historical situatedness and the need for the project of freedoms, currently curtailed geopolitically and intellectually in the public sphere. Obviously it's not translated across the whole of the spectrum of work in terms of emotions and affect, and my paper in 2006 flagged up some of the issues in the argument with in discussion with Divya P, etc. But the project initiated was certainly about progressive politics of freedoms and challenging the ways in which capital accumulates through manipulating the senses and emotions, and that still resonates today. So in the terms of the talk today, I want to start with a notion of negations. And when thinking about race, affect and emotions, there are also scholarly evasions, exclusions and indeed negations that defile the project of research within the humanities and the social sciences, and I flagged those up in the progress reviews in terms of thinking about the body within the academy. So whether thinking philosophically, politically, or indeed in terms of writing histories, certain bodies, creativities, sensibilities and lived worlds are edited out of the dialogue, and my paper starts with the problem of negations that inspires me to do the work that I do. So these are three familiar examples of negations that are in the public sphere. So in terms of these are bodies that were out of place, the bodies of Rodney King, Trayvon Martin and Charles Jimenez. And in terms of contemporary world and the remnants of scientific racism, which was emergent in the 19th century, I would argue that these remnants of scientific racism are alive and well in the cultures, in public cultures and in our everyday cultures. So to put it another way, the mismeasure of man is still occurring, and the only things that shifted are the technologies we use to mismeasure. So today we call it cultural profiling, and the tools we use are retina scanners and biometrics, and bodies and their capacities to feel, to think and to be implicated in these regimes of truth interplay our everyday transactions. So in terms of the current story in the press about ways in which we use our bank cards, the ways in which we are profiled through data downloads and measured within a matrix of citizenry, we're worked through in terms of what sort of formulation of feeling in terms of our relationship with the consensus. So when we're talking about racist stereotyping, discourses and representations in the news, or indeed the ways in which academic philosophy and the institutions of politics, culture and art reflect the present and represent the present world to us, is important. So racialization shapes our sensory matrices of pain, power, mobility, control, and our creative imaginations to be. And that's racialization across the spectrum. I'm not talking about the other, I'm talking about the whole of the spectrum of humanity. So this is a sphere of continual negation, so in Kathleen Stewart's terms, ordinary affects which are felt, responded to, and which form drivers of the daily metabolic rhythms of our cities and society. However, there's a disengage between our sensibilities as human beings and the capacities for all of us to be and embody the freedom to roam. So in terms of the mismeasurement, there is a limitation placed on the majority world, if you like. So there are certain negations of certain bodies from our streets, from our histories, and from our cultural institutes, including the academy. And in terms of the majority world perspective, that's what I want to introduce here today. So in terms of how important this is right now, we're in a moment where a particular sort of range of negation is occurring in terms of Iraqi or Islamic cultural heritage, in terms of writing histories, what it is to be an Islamic citizen is being one that's narrowed and denuded. So Iraqi cultural heritage, for example, is just one example of how the ways in which we represent peoples, places and worlds is deeply linked with the geopolitics of the present and the future. As Mesopotamian treasures, narratives and evidence are removed from an Iraq-centred account of history, or indeed a sense of self, the possibilities of empowering a proud and defiant citizenry fade too. I'm not saying that having a museum is evidence of a worldly place or a worldly voice in political terms, but the sensibilities of a nation are housed therein, and any imperial intervention can only destroy, delude or make invisible the potentialities for a future. Without a cultural memory of a fine past of Iraq, a confidence, a fulfilling knowledge of what is possible is poisoned. Cultural heritage epitomises the ways in which the histories of folk give a timeless foundation for possibilities of a human culture, and thus acknowledge the capacities for thinking, feeling, poetics, and citizenship. So this is an example of a project that's about picturing the world from the majority world position. So it's thinking about, actually, yeah. Some computers you can go to the site, this one's not allowing me to do it, but if you go to this site, there's an attempt to think about the problematics of a majority world-centred account of self, if you like. So one of the problematics of thinking post-humanly, if you like, of diving towards a non-anthropocentric account of the world, without looking at the basis of human within this account, is folly. In a world where the majority world do not have significant visibility, security in terms of food, health, shelter, and political or human rights, nor indeed have been counted as human in the 20th century, in terms of philosophy, history, or indeed public culture. By the majority world, in this instance, I'm talking about the non-white others of Said's narration, and the world whose sensibilities are put to the margin in our public cultures and political cultures of responsibility and progress. By putting these sensibilities to one side, we negate the majority population and indeed dehumanise the encounter, the legacy and histories of being human. This violation of what human can be, has been and is the effect of imperial visions and philosophies. My research is focused on just one aspect of the violations of previous versions of humanity. And in terms of thinking about this, this is an expression or example of the politics of emotion, affect and sensibilities that shape our valuing of others historically and in our own heritage practice. I situate the research at the temple to otherness, if you like, the National Museum in the UK, such as the British Museum, and has bled into reviews of thinking about Te Papa in New Zealand. And in terms of where I take you to a version of emotional geographies of the museum, while privileging an account of the other. That's being the other and outsider to the account of human civilization that is told there. So what's important here is to ensure that any thinking around affect and emotion avoids ethnocentrism and universalism. And that's what I'm, in my own research, is keeping in mind. So in the paper in 2006, what I was talking about was making sure that we have a responsible engagement with the political nature of theory, and that includes the philosophies of Kant, Hegel, and others. And also to think about the infinite complexity of affect itself. So the project of content philosophy sometimes denies those other complexities because of an account or a situatedness in the ethnocentric. So the development of any theoretical project that lacks historiosity and thus a memory of theoretical critiques of universalism are defunct. Throughout my academic life, I've been concerned with questions of sensibility. So while in Britain, as a British citizen, there's been a constant jarring of my own feeling of being and notions of authentic, or having authentic English sensibilities, the Britishness of citizenship as linked to landscape is where I started out. These jarring moments are sometimes those experienced by the majority population in a world when faced with a society based on the philosophy, aesthetics and framework of thinking that is designed through imperial values, governance and promulgated from the structures of feeling that have circulated since. And I come from a position in post-colonial theory. As Robert J.C. Young argues, this is what he says: Englishness is translated from the national identity of the English living in England into a diasporic identity beyond any geographical boundary, which included all English who had emigrated all over the world. So Englishness is only meaningful. The emotional landscape of England includes the colonies of the British Empire and the citizens therein, and only comes to have meaning outside the firm state boundaries of Britain. Despite this, when black bodies arrive in Britain, they remain outside the body politic of the Union, as people like Paul Gilroy have argued historically, and also in terms of thinking about great British culture. British artists who have worked outside the colonies and returned in terms of European institutions have experienced discordancy. So the work of Ingrid Pollard, for example, underlines this argument. So in the 1980s, Black British artists such as Sonia Boyce, Lorraine Himid, and many others, Keith Piper, had a body of work that was talking about engaging with the black body being out of place at sites of British culture, such as the library, the art gallery, and the European landscape. And in terms of more recently, the artist Lorraine Himid has curated this exhibition that's up here, called The Thin Black Line. And in 2010, how over the last 20 or 30 years things haven't changed. What struck me in particular was the need to continue to reframe and represent the issues of invisibility, but also that the aesthetics and form of those images and artefacts haven't really shifted ground. So consumed with the energy of challenging invisibility means that you're denying a group of folk in terms of artistic conscience or artistic practice, if you like. Rashid Noreen recently resigned from the board of Third Text, argued that in his exhibition The Other Story in 1989, the exhibition was held at the Hayward Gallery, highlighted the historical importance of the works and the achievements of non-white artists in Britain, which were institutionally suppressed, ignored or marginalised. I'm using Britain here as an example, and I think these practices are alive and well across Europe. It's not to do with Britain, but I don't want to claim. Yeah, so I'm trying to be scholarly and not generous to the European practice. So in terms of Britain, The Other Story was in 1989, and in these early years, this is what he says, recognising the contribution of black bodies to European canon with a focus of Himid, Boyce and Areen, and these were suppressed, ignored and marginalised from the mainstream canon. Next week is an exhibition opening at Tate Britain to try and repatriate, if you like, African artists in terms of this canon. And it's the first attempt in over 2 decades of trying to work through the history of artists that have been trained, homegrown artists, if you like, trained at the Royal Academy and trained at the Slade, who have exited the state boundaries. But again, in terms of black culture, national museums and how they narrate them are still logged into this way of negating other histories and the relationship between Britain and the rest of the world. So in terms of black culture at the museum, there's, in their own ways, these are negated, violated, dehumanised, and in terms of the way in which I'm thinking about these museum spaces, they continue to form a theatre of pain for the majority world population. This is not necessarily intentionally. I mean, Rosanna and I work with all these institutions, and these institutions, over the last 20 or 30 years. I mean, Tate Britain Museum is a different example because of the bipartisan agreement, but in terms of thinking about the intentions, separately, the discourses around the cultures of Maori, Aboriginal, Inuit are informed and tainted by the legacy of imperialist geography, anthropology, biology, and archaeology. I want to demonstrate how this theatre of pain works, perhaps also as an introduction to our special session with Rosanna later this afternoon at 3 o'clock, so please do join us. Okay, so this is an example of other exhibitions that are exhibited at the British Museum, so I hope these will take us to, in terms of the aesthetics that are offered, we're quite familiar, and I think in Europe and Germany also, these are aesthetics that are quite familiar.
Our house is decent size, 2 stories, all our own. Family upstairs, and my husband's baby downstairs. It's warm, unusually warm. My husband was always up early for work. I'd make sure the slaves had the children up and dressed, just like we do on any normal day.
Okay, I'll stop there because the British Museum account of Herculean and Pompeii is about putting bodies back into the artefact, and that's something that I want you to hold on to. So in terms of representation at the museum, this is an example of a key text on the Maori collections, and when you go to the museum, this is what we do. So in terms of thinking about the object that we encounter, the object becomes a metaphor for nation, for embodying particular capacities, grammars and vocabularies, And looking onto the object, the act of looking onto an object within a cabinet, is about making known the culture of peoples. So we embody a colonial gaze, so delimiting, captivating, and thinking about naming and working through a chronology in terms of time and space and situatedness. So embodied in this practice of looking on and reducing is a violence, an epistemic violence in terms of the naming and the labelling systems, but also a violence in terms of the editing out of particular narratives. So Henry Louis Gates, professor most famously arrested at his front door for being black in the Obama regime, his project has been about bringing to the eye what we don't normally see, and in terms of the project is about offering a counter-narrative to archives where the black body or the black life, if you like, has been edited out, or that challenges the fundamental value systems that just dictated the representation of other cultures. So in terms of remembering the philosophies and thoughts that frame the ways in which we think about, emotions, feelings, humanities, we must remember the cornerstones of European historical thought and the racism within that. And I think sometimes we don't think holistically about the roots of philosophy. So here's a quote from Immanuel Kant, who argues that the Negroes of Africa have by nature no feeling that arises above the trifling. So fundamental is the difference between these two races of man, and it appears to be as great in regard to mental capacities as in colour. And this is a quote from Hegel, who's talking about the value of art and beauty. Now, someone like Rashid Noreen has argued that the curating of art museums and museums such as the Bush Museum have been based on Hegelian values. So historically, the Egyptian galleries are not part of a discourse around Africa, and Africa to this day remains about an ethnographic conceptualization of Africa, which removes notions of civilizations, the history of writing, and resorts to representing pots and hair braids and practices of living. It's an ethnographic account of a set of peoples and people within art history and other spaces have argued that these values are remnants of a scientific racism that came before. And this is why. The idea as reality, shaped in accordance with the concept of the idea, is the defectiveness of a work of art. It's not always to be regarded as due, as may be supposed, to the artist's lack of skill. On the contrary, defectiveness of form results from defectiveness of content. So, for example, the Chinese, Indians, and Egyptians, in their artistic shapes, images of gods and idols, never get beyond a formless or a bad and untrue definitiveness of form. They could not master true beauty because their mythological ideas, the content and thought of their works of art, were still indeterminate or determined badly, and so did not consist of content, which is absolute in itself. Works of art are all the more excellent in expressing true beauty, the deeper is the inner truth of their content and thought. And obviously in Hegel's hierarchy of cultural forms, European cultural art and practice was at the top of the hierarchy, and the others are below. So in terms of thinking of the legacies of those sorts of philosophies and value systems as they're present in the 21st century, this is an example of what museums are trying to do. So this is Professor Jack Lohman, the director of the Museum of London Group in 2005, arguing that we need to recognise and reconcile some of the pain that has gone before. I'd like to speak on something that other people may not say. Many museums were born out of the pain of conquest. I feel there is a need for the museum community to acknowledge that pain. Museums that present the culture of the world need to acknowledge the story by which those collections were acquired, and an apology for that pain is necessary. Now, my engagement isn't really about just the pain of people's families being removed, or the problematics of repatriation, or the problematics of community ownership. It's very much about the epistemic violences and thinking through of imperial accounts or narratives, if you like, of peoples and their society of ideas, if you like. So one thing we're working through in terms of our projects is to keep genealogies live. And that's a patronising attitude, actually, because the genealogies are already alive and well for the communities who have a connection with material cultures and museum spaces. The second, as Loman says, acknowledging the pain and notions of repatriation and ownership are important. But for artists and curators such as the two that I work with, Rosanna Raymond and Kahuto Takanawa, over decades of trying to make sure that pieces of artwork are recognised as artwork, recognised for what they are, has been a battle. And they've got to the situation where, so for example, Rosanna has got to a situation where the museum no longer can be trusted to tell the whole story, and the museum is no longer a space where you can have your cultural histories reflected. So the body, in fact, becomes a museum, and that links to a sort of sensibility that I'll work through in a moment. So going back to the epistemic violences, so the British Museum holds the largest Maori collection outside of New Zealand. This is a quote from their online archive, including some items of major artistic cultural significance, a detailed catalogue describing over 2,300 items, including wood carvings, model canoes and paddles, domestic equipment, cloaks, baskets, bags, jewellery, musical instruments, ceremonial objects, fishing and hunting equipment, tools, weapons, and modern ceramics. Now, I've deleted the word New Zealand. I'd like you to replace it with your particular citizenry. So if you replace that with England or Scotland or Sweden or the Netherlands, you can see the extent of the violences we're talking about. And it's not that we don't all as a group experience them, but this is, several centuries after Cook first brought these items over. So the effect of sort of imperial accounts are to deaden, denude and violate meanings and narratives. And in terms of being counter to what material culture should actually do, and what they should actually do is about keeping alive a memory. So if all of the best that has been fought and made is what we're trying to protect and save and celebrate, a lot of these are about memory linked to a culture of territory, of land or belonging. And they're narrated within a particular set of grammars, language, and senses of self-determination. And in terms of that process, in terms of that embodied, or trying to be an embodied account of the meanings of material cultures, these become craft and not art, and a secondary layer of violation begins again. So in terms of the values that precede are ethnographic rather than regimes, apologies, or accounts of particular schools of thought, if you like. So in terms of what is important is to disrupt these accounts of stasis and material cultures not being about a static account, and the museums are attempting to do that. But thinking differently in terms of geological time, for example, or transnational time and space, is absolutely where these objects are at. So when we're thinking about the Maori collections, none of those material cultures are always about a particular moment in time or space. So in terms of their presence and giving life to the space around them, that's one thing that I hope that you take away from today. This is an example of the work of Kahuto Takanawa. So her family are an acclaimed family of weavers, so that Picasso doesn't cut it in terms of their reputation internationally and their heartfelt presence in the genealogy of Maori culture. So Kahuto Takanawa is the daughter of Digores Takanawa, who died sadly 2 years ago. And it's a family of masterines, so if the Queen arrives in New Zealand, it's her family that's commissioned to give a gift to the head of state. And again, this piece of cloth is presented as a piece of cloth. So this is a cloak that's in the National Museum of Scotland, I think now. It's presented as art, as craft and not art. And in terms of the cloak itself, what Kahuto argues is that there's a whole layer of genealogical knowledges and cultural heritage that are about her country that are negated, and this is how they're negated. This is how the British Museum account describes it. This is a description currently found. This is a rectangular cloak of finger-woven creamy white New Zealand flax, decorated with the Latin name, decorated with Pukeko pheasant feathers, with Taniko border, neck border in open work with drawstring, etc., etc. And this is what the cloak represents to Kahuto. So in terms of the cloak, it's an example of an artefact that she was asked to talk through with curators. So I met Kahuto in Otago, where the Otago Museum were refusing for the Maori Tutumi academics to work through their archive with them, until the curator changed in the last sort of 5 years. And the curator wanted people to ask, to describe what the meanings of different artefacts were. And her answer each time was, it's written in the weave or it's written in the fabric. And the things that are written in the fabric are firstly a stewardship of the land that enables you to produce that fabric, so the stories of the different pieces of fabric and feather and the ways in which we maintain a sustainable resource for being able to produce those in the future. But also this notion of Maori isn't situated in a particular place or a particular time. It's about enfranchisement to a sequence of carriers of knowledge and an enfranchisement to a sense of knowledge and cultural heritage that's inherited. So in terms of thinking about nation and state history, this is very much an Earth's Eye history that's woven together. And in terms of a national culture, it's not a national culture defined through blood and earth and soil, but one that's through engaging or investing in a self-defined relationship with those knowledge systems of before. So in terms of Rosanna's story, as I said to you, this is this experience of having the museum not reflect Maori nations or indeed Polynesian nations, because it doesn't work through individual artefacts, means that it's only contained then in the visceral accounts of people like Kuhuto and Rosanna, because the fighting for representation has been a dead end, including when British Museum recurates galleries in the 21st century. This is what she says. This is her poem, Silence of the Gods, and she's been kind enough to allow me to work with her. A throng of gods assembled in silence, accused of decadence, offered out of deference, emptied of resonance, collected for reference, and now in idle consideration, engaged in your estrangement, I gaze at you like a stranger, enjoying your sing-song that fell on deaf ears. I give you my name and you give me your number, to revive you, to revere you. This is what she says. To read about yourself labelled as hybrid and having your authenticity questioned by people outside your community left me feeling disempowered. I was often frustrated at the many mistakes and misrepresentation that appeared in articles, especially by people who had spent very little or no time with us or within our community. Often our involvement as practitioners was welcomed, but our analysis of what we were doing was not considered as important unless validated by an educated expert, such as an Oxford graduate. So what happens to Taonga is that they're deadened as artefacts. Now, the episode that I mentioned about the British Museum recurating the galleries was at once something to be celebrated, but also with its own problematics. So for the community of Maori living in London, they were invited in to help think about these, as we call material cultures, but actually they're directly connected with ancestors and directly connected with allowing them to live, to bring them back into a world of light, if you like. And this is a celebratory moment. And in terms of the removal of Taonga from their original place and purpose, there is a pain embedded in that. This is before we even get to the epistemic violences. So in terms of having an ancestor removed from your own, from the circulation of your everyday family life, is part and parcel of the sort of process of pain. So in terms of what Rosanna's been able to do in terms of the recreation of the galleries was to enliven the work and to re-magic, if you like, the ways in which the world of light was brought into the space of imperial sort of reduction and denudation. And this is an example of an evening where the British Museum gave up those galleries for Ngāti Ranana to welcome them back in and to allow them to take ownership of the community of ancestors. And in terms of the effect of that is, first of all, community ownership, but also an opening for people to narrate their own histories and think about the meanings and genealogies that are embedded in the material cultures that were there before. So you can have more of that later at 3 o'clock. I'm sure you're all very busy, but there's an opportunity. Okay, just to conclude then, The Posthuman at the beginning of the conference is very much a space for Bradiotti to think, and I'm very grateful for her. And this is what she said: I take the posthuman predicament as an opportunity to empower the pursuit of alternative schemes of thought, knowledge and self-representation. The posthuman condition urges us to think critically and creatively about who and what we are actually in the process of becoming. So it's a reflective move, and thinking about what the assumptions around the human are as part of a project that Rosie's encountering. In terms of the posthuman, many of the scholars are talking about posthuman and transhuman. So Nick Bostrom, the director of the Future of Humanity Institute at Oxford University, full of Maori scholars and others, I imagine, is talking about the ways in which posthuman is about transcending the capabilities and capacities that we have. And we've all talked about robotics and technology enhancing eyesight, sensory experiences of the world, and our abilities to feel and experience the world. And ultimately, the project for Bostrom is sensual pleasure is the future focus. When thinking the possibility of post-humanly happy beings and their psychological properties, one must abstract from contingent features of the human psyche. An experience that would consume us might perhaps merely be spicy to a post-human mind. What I was struck on reading this stuff was that it's very similar to the narrative that Hegel has about the savage, the state of sensuality, and the enhanced sensibilities that are engaged, in a or reduced to sort of very ephemeral account. The Negro, as already observed, exhibits the natural man in his completely wild and untamed state. We must lay aside all thought of reverence and morality, all that we call feeling, if we would rightly comprehend him. There is nothing harmonious with humanity to be found in this type of character. The copious and circumstantial accounts of missionaries completely confirm this, and Mohammedanism appears to be the only thing which in any way brings a Negro within the range of culture. I was struck in the 21st century of the irony of the last sentence, and being in an age where Islamic fundamentalism is the greatest sort of enemy. So Rosie ends, for me, with this nice direction. The first thing a feminist critique can do is to acknowledge the aporias and the aphasias of stereotypical frameworks and look with hope in the direction of women artists. And I hope that I've explained how I've managed to do that with the work that I'm doing. I'll stop there. Thank you.